Mr. Speaker, maple syrup. It doesn't get much more Canadian than that. We can all imagine the crunch of snow under our boots, the steam coming off of the evaporator, treating our kids, and maybe ourselves too, Mr. Speaker, if we're being honest, to some maple taffy when we pour warm syrup into a bucket of clean, fresh snow. There aren't too many things more closely tied to our rural Canadian identity than producing maple syrup. And yet, even this time-honored Canadian tradition is at risk due to the impacts of climate change. There is more and more research showing that warming temperatures and the loss of snowpack is having a negative and costly impact on the production of maple syrup, and therefore on family farms that produce them. These are family businesses that keep our rural communities sustainable. This isn't news, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, we have known this for some time. As far back as 2008, a study was published about the Hassler Farm in Flinton, a community in my riding. From 1956 to 2007, tree tapping for maple syrup shifted a full 2 weeks earlier. The temperature range that's needed to produce maple syrup is becoming briefer and the season shorter. In fact, in 2012, our production of maple syrup in Ontario fell by 54% because of how unusually warm the spring was, since Canada produces 70% of the world's maple syrup. This has an impact on our rural communities, on our rural economy, including our family farms. You can ask any farmer in my riding and they will confirm the weather is getting wackier all the time. I heard from my constituent Matt at the Hastings Stewardship Council, and he told me that that we really need to prepare for the changes that are already happening and more that are going to happen. Farmers want to pass their farms to the next generation. Through low-till and no-till practices, good stewardship, environmental farm plans, and more, farmers are making great efforts to fight climate change. And unfortunately, they are also the ones first to suffer from its effects through severe weather events like drought and flood. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to confirm that I'll be splitting my time with the member from Guelph. Sorry about that. When farmers can't grow food, it's an emergency, and we are all in trouble. Mr. Speaker, let me tell you about 5 or 6 100-year events in my rural community. I say 100-year events, but actually they all happened in the last 6 years. It's 2013 in beautiful town of Bancroft, and there's a state of emergency. Floodwaters have risen, washed out roads. 3 schools had to shut their doors. The Children's Center was shuttered. 83-year-old Arnold Creighton was quoted as saying he lived there his whole life and had never seen anything like it. It's 2014 in Corbyville and Foxborough, villages in my riding that fall under the city of Belleville. There's another state of emergency. The mayor at that time was my good friend, the member from Bay of Quinte, who was out there day after day sandbagging and helping to coordinate the relief. Now it's 2016, and our farmers are hurting. 60 days without solid rainfalls was producing burnt and premature crops and costing our farm families. It's the worst drought in my area since record keeping began in the 1800s. In 2017 comes around, Mr. Speaker. We start the year with Quinte Conservation warning residents of the Napanee River watershed that they will have worse floods than even 2014. I get almost daily updates from Chief Donald Miracle of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte telling me the devastating effects that flooding is having on homes on the Tyne Mohawk territory. Properties in Amherst Island and Hay Bay are underwater, and not just by inches, by feet. Mr. Speaker, those who have not experienced flooding themselves aren't always aware of all the subsequent impacts. Rural properties are usually on septic and well systems, both of which can be compromised by floods. But 2017 was just getting started, Mr. Speaker. It seemed like Mother Nature was playing a cruel joke after all the flooding, But by summer and fall, the Moira River was experiencing the lowest water levels and droughts since keeping began. Even worse than 2016, whose drought had already exacted a terrible toll on our farming community. And now this year, Mr. Speaker, 2019, I recently visited properties in Bancroft, Hastings Highlands, and Corbyville that were underwater yet again. And roads washed out in Tweed and North Hastings. 21 roads washed out in North Hastings that they had to deal with. And we don't have to look far to see the devastating toll right here in Ottawa, in the Ottawa region. Amid all of this historic flooding and the hard work that our conservation authorities have to do to help our community, it's mind-boggling to see that the Ford government has cut flood prevention funding to our local conservation authorities in half.
Shame.
These are conservative cuts, Mr. Speaker, conservatives that don't take climate change seriously. Extreme weather events have a cost, Mr. Speaker, a very human cost that we see on the faces of distraught homeowners who have lost everything. And there is also a massive financial cost. Last year, extreme weather cost Canadians $1.9 billion. From 1990 until 2009, the average was $400 million a year. That number is only rising and is estimated to be as high as $43 billion by 2050 if we don't act. My constituents are awake to the impacts of climate change in our rural communities. I heard from Louise at Harvest Hastings, who reminded me of the increase in diseases affecting trees due to the warming temperatures. Emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, beech bark diseases, ash wilt, and the list goes on and on. And all of this leaves our forests more susceptible to the devastating impact of wildfires. The Ford government's cuts to planting 50 million trees is not helping this problem, Mr. Speaker. And to add insult to injury, these seedlings in Eastern Ontario are going to be destroyed because of the Ford conservative cuts. Climate change is also causing rural communities like mine to have a higher incidence of ticks, which is a cause of Lyme disease. This has devastating health impacts. I have 3 personal friends whose health has been impacted for the last 5 to 6 years because of Lyme disease. This has, and it's happening more and more often. These are 3 personal friends of my own that live in my own community. And I can tell you, to see them trying to recover from this disease where their immune systems have been compromised. I mean, 2 of them had diagnosed originally with cancer because the impact was so dreadful upon them. Climate change is also causing rural communities like mine to have a higher, sorry about that. You know, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of conservatives who represent rural ridings. When you look at the devastating impacts from climate change is already having on our rural communities and to our farm families, it becomes clear that the Conservatives are doing a disservice to their constituents by fighting climate action instead of fighting climate change. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the fight against climate change is one of the most important fights of our generation, and future generations depend on us. As a lifelong environmentalist from my days growing up learning good stewardship practices while hunting and fishing in Madoc in the 60s and 70s, to starting the first recycling program in my apartment building during my young professional days in Toronto in the 80s, to fighting as a community activist in Tyonega Township to protect our community's drinking water against the mega dump expansion in Napanee from the 1990s to this very day, one thing is clear. I will never stop fighting to protect our environment, our community, and future generations. Extreme weather events across Canada and the world are increasing. Forest fires in the west, tornadoes in Ottawa, historic droughts and floods right in our own rural community. The science is clear and the impact on human lives is clear. We cannot leave it to our children to pay the vast vastly higher, even existential costs of climate change. We know how to solve this, and it is our duty as parents, as citizens and legislators to act. This is a climate emergency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.